The most devastating attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor wasn't carried out by enemy forces. It was executed by allies. Stay until the end, because what happened in the Nevada desert in 1984 changed military doctrine forever. How did 30 men infiltrate the most secure military installation in the United States without being detected? How did they destroy a facility guarded by thousands of American troops? And why did the Pentagon try to bury the report for 3 years? The desert breathes differently at night. On February 18, 1984, the air above Nelis Air Force Base carried the weight of cold stars and the hum of confidence. This American military might condensed into 143 square miles of fortified Nevada sand. Razor wire glinted under floodlights. Guard towers punctured the horizon every 300 meters. Patrol vehicles swept the perimeter in coordinated 15-minute intervals. Inside the wire, 4,000 personnel moved through their routines. With the certainty that comes from being untouchable, the base wasn't just defended. It was a statement. State-of-the-art motion sensors lined every approach. Thermal imaging cameras scanned the darkness. Attack helicopters sat ready on tarmacs, pilots on 10-minute standby. The 414th Fighter Wing maintained constant air patrols. Overhead, this wasn't a military base. This was a fortress designed by the most technologically advanced military in human history. Somewhere in that darkness, 30 men waited. They had been waiting for 3 days. Buried in shallow scrapes no deeper than 18 inches. Covered in camouflage netting that matched the desert floor with forensic precision, they had remained motionless while American patrols passed within. Arm's reach. They had not eaten hot food. They had not stood. They had urinated into bottles and defecated into plastic bags that would be carried out when the mission ended. For 72 hours, they had become part of landscape. These were not American soldiers. They were Australian Special Air Service Regiment operators, and they had come to Nevada with a singular purpose: to prove that the most defended military installation in the United States could be destroyed by a force 1/10 its size, using nothing but patience, discipline, and a philosophy of warfare that American doctrine had forgotten. The mission was called Exercise Gallant Eagle. On paper, it was a routine training evolution designed to test base security protocols. In reality, it was a challenge issued by SOCOM commanders who believed their defenses were impenetrable. The Australian SAS had been invited to test those defenses. The invitation was extended with the quiet confidence of men who knew they were right. The Australians accepted with the silent certainty of men who knew they were not. The Americans expected a frontal probe. They anticipated noise and movement, a simulated assault that would be detected, engaged, and repelled within the Epilogue. First hour. Their entire defensive posture was built on the assumption that attackers would announce themselves. That warfare was a competition of firepower and speed. They had radar. They had infrared. They had dogs and drones and enough firepower to level a city block in under 30 seconds. What they did not have was patience. The Australian SAS understood something that American military doctrine had engineered out of its soul in pursuit of technological dominance: that warfare is not always loud, that invisibility is more powerful than armor, that the willingness to endure discomfort longer than your enemy can endure, vigilance is a weapon that no radar can detect. This understanding was not theoretical. It was carved into the regiment's DNA through jungles in Vietnam and Borneo, through desert operations in the Middle East, through decades of operating in environments where being seen meant being dead. The SAS had learned that modern warfare's obsession with overwhelming force had created a blind spot. Militaries built to project power had forgotten how to defend against patience. On the first night, the Australian reconnaissance teams moved into position. They did not walk. Walking creates rhythm, and rhythm creates pattern, and pattern creates detection. They crawled, 6 inches at a time, freezing when headlights swept across the desert, remaining motionless when patrol helicopters thundered overhead. Rotor wash kicked up dust that settled onto their backs like a second skin. It took them 11 hours to cover 3 kilometers. American sentries saw nothing. Motion sensors registered only the movement of desert wind. Guard dogs caught no scent because the Australians had spent 2 weeks before the exercise eating the same rations as American troops, conditioning their bodies to emit the same chemical signatures. Thermal cameras detected no heat differential because the operators wore specialized suits that dispersed body temperature across a wider surface area. They had not outsmarted American technology. They had simply understood its limitations better. Than the men who built it. By dawn, the assault teams were in position. They lay in hide sites constructed with such care that American patrols walked past them 17 times over the next 2 days without seeing anything unusual. The hides were not deep. They could not be deep because digging leaves evidence. Instead, they were shallow depressions enhanced with natural materials, positioned with an understanding of how human vision works. Sentries looked for anomalies, for things that break patterns. The Australian hides did not break the pattern. They became patterns. Inside those hides, men controlled their breathing. They did not sleep in shifts, because shifting creates movement. They microslepted, a technique developed in Vietnam, where operators learned to enter partial rest states while maintaining perimeter awareness. Heart rates slowed to 50 beats per minute. Breathing became shallow enough that sand placed on their chests would not stir. This was not training. This was a transformation. The human body rebels against stillness, demands movement, insists on comfort. The SAS had learned to negotiate with that rebellion, to explain to their nervous systems that survival required temporary surrender. On the second day, an American patrol stopped 6 meters from one of the hide sites. 4 soldiers, fresh from a guard rotation, sat on the desert floor to eat lunch. They talked about sports and women and the tedium of guard duty. Beneath his camouflage netting, an Australian operator watched them through a gap no wider than a coin. He did not blink. Blinking creates micro-movements that draw the eye. He breathes through his nose in cycles timed to last 90 seconds per breath. His rifle lay beside him, loaded but not chambered, because chambering a round creates sound. For 43 minutes, he watched American soldiers eat sandwiches close enough that he could smell their coffee. They never saw him. When they stood and walked away, one soldier stepped on the edge of his hide site, and netting flexed but did not break. The operator waited 30 minutes after they left before allowing himself to blink normally. This was not luck. This was the product of selection standards that reject 97% of applicants, of training cycles that last 18 months, of a culture that understands patience as the ultimate tactical advantage. The Australian SAS does not celebrate aggression. It celebrates control. The regimental motto, "Who dares wins," is not an invitation to recklessness. It is a statement about calculated risk, about the courage required to remain still when instinct screams to move. The American military had evolved differently. Vietnam had taught the United States that overwhelming firepower applied rapidly could compensate for most tactical disadvantages. Desert Storm had reinforced that lesson with precision bombing and shock and awe doctrine. By 1984, American military philosophy had crystallized around a simple premise: see first, shoot hardest. Sensors would provide awareness. Technology would provide an advantage. Speed would provide victory. This philosophy had conquered armies. But it had not prepared for an enemy that refused to be seen. On the third night, the assault began. 2,300 hours. New moon. Cloud cover reduces ambient light by 70%. The base was at routine alert status. No elevated threat condition. Guard rotations proceeded on schedule. Patrol patterns had not varied in 3 days, because there was no reason to vary them. Nothing unusual had been detected. Nothing unusual had happened. The Australian assault teams rose from their hides like ghosts given form. They did not run. Running creates noise and thermal signatures. They moved in a combat glide that kept their center of gravity low and their footfalls silent. Each man carried 60 pounds of equipment, but their movement created no more sound than wind over sand. The perimeter breach took 4 minutes. Not 4 minutes of cutting through fences. 4 minutes to pass through checkpoints that should have been impossible to penetrate. The Australians had spent 3 days watching. They knew the patrol schedules down to the second. They understood. The gaps in sensor coverage, the dead zones created when security systems are layered without accounting for their overlapping blind spots. They knew that guards watch most carefully at the beginning and end of shifts, that attention drifts in the middle hours, that human vigilance cannot be sustained without variation. They moved through those gaps like water through cracks in stone. Not forcing, flowing. The first objective was the motorpool. 16 vehicles sat in neat rows, keys in a lockbox that was secured, but not alarmed, because it was inside the perimeter, and inside the perimeter meant safe. An Australian operator picked the lock in 40 seconds using a tension wrench and rake made from dental tools. He did not force the lock. Forcing leaves evidence. He persuaded me. The keys were removed, pocketed, and the lock was re-engaged. No one would know they had been there until morning count revealed missing vehicles. But the vehicles were not missing. They were parked exactly where they had been. Their fuel lines had been cut with surgical precision, incisions so clean they would not leak until the engine started and created pressure. When morning came and those vehicles were needed, they would fail simultaneously, stranding quick reaction forces in a parking lot while smoke grenades created the illusion of catastrophic damage. The second objective was the armoury. This was more delicate. Armed guards stood post at both entrances, rotated every 4 hours, backed by biometric locks and blast-proof doors. The armoury could not be breached silently. So the Australians did not breach it. They marked it. Thermal tags. Invisible to the naked eye, but screaming bright under infrared. In a real conflict, those tags would guide precision munitions. For this exercise, they simply documented that the armoury could be targeted without the guards ever knowing they had been designated. The third objective was the command center. This was the heart of base operations, the node from which all defensive coordination flowed. It sat in the center of the installation, surrounded by 3 layers of security, monitored by cameras covering every approach angle. The Australians had watched those cameras for 3 days. They knew the coverage patterns. More importantly, they knew that cameras are binary, that they either see or they do not see, and that vision is not understanding. 6 operators moved into camera view. They did not hide. They walked with the confident gait of personnel who belonged, wearing uniform elements acquired from laundry facilities during their infiltration. At a distance, under limited light, they were indistinguishable from legitimate base personnel. They approached the command center along routes that would make them visible for no more than 8 seconds per camera. 8 seconds is not enough time for human monitors to process suspicion, especially when what they see matches their expectation of normalcy. The operators reached the external wall of the command center and placed simulated explosive charges at structural stress points identified from base blueprints acquired during the planning phase. The charges were marked with chemical tags that would photograph under UV light proof of placement. In a combat scenario, the command center would have been destroyed before anyone inside understood they were under attack, but the mission was not complete. The Australian SAS had not come to Nevada to prove they could destroy a base. They had come to prove they could do it invisibly. Destruction is easy. Vanishing is art. The withdrawal began at 0200 hours. Charges placed, vehicles sabotaged, armoury marked, command structure compromised. The Australian teams reversed their infiltration routes, moving through the same gaps in coverage they had used to enter. They did not rush. Rushing creates mistakes. They moved with the same patient precision that had carried them in, stopping every 30 meters to verify their backtrail, ensuring no equipment had been dropped, no footprints left in areas where. Footprints would raise questions. By 0400 hours, they were beyond the perimeter. By 0600 hours, they were 8 kilometers from the base, dug into new hide sites, waiting for dawn and the chaos they knew would follow. The alarm was raised at 0730 hours during routine morning inspection. A maintenance. Officer noticed cut fuel lines. Within minutes, the base went to full alert. Attack helicopters launched. Ground teams swept the perimeter. Dogs were deployed. Sensors were checked and rechecked. The command center reviewed camera footage. Guard posts were interrogated. They found nothing. No breach point, no footprints, no foreign DNA, no electronic signature. The base had been penetrated by a force that left less evidence than a ghost. The exercise controllers called FINEX at 1100 hours. FINEX means finished exercise, the moment when simulation ends and accountability begins. The Australian SAS teams emerged from their hide sites and walked back to the base they had just destroyed. They carried their marker tags, their documentation, their photographic evidence of placement. They were not triumphant. They were professional. This was not a victory. This was validation. The debrief lasted 6 hours. American commanders sat in stunned silence as Australian officers walked them through the operation timeline. Every infiltration route mapped. Every sensor gap is documented. Every patrol pattern is exploited. The Americans had questions. How? Did you avoid the dogs? How did you defeat thermal imaging? How did you know the patrol schedules? The Australian answers were not secrets. They were principles. You avoid dogs by controlling your scent profile. You defeat thermal imaging by understanding that it detects differential, not presence. You know patrol schedules by watching long enough to see the pattern. But beneath those tactical answers lay something the Americans found harder to accept. A fundamental philosophical difference about warfare is the United States had built a military designed to win through technological superiority and overwhelming force. The Australian SAS had built a capability designed to win through patience and invisibility. Both approaches were valid, but only one could penetrate a fortress designed to stop the other. The American military, in 1984, was the most powerful fighting force in human history. It could project power across continents, could reduce cities to rubble from altitude's enemy. Forces could not reach, could coordinate operations across time zones with precision measured in milliseconds. But it had forgotten how to defend against silence. This forgetting was not accidental. It was the logical conclusion of an arms race that prioritized technological advantage over fundamental principles. Since World War II, American defense doctrine had moved steadily toward mechanization, toward systems that could replace human judgment with electronic certainty. Radar instead of sentries, thermal imaging instead of observation, motion sensors instead of intuition. These systems worked spectacularly, well against conventional threats. But they shared a common vulnerability. They were designed to detect action, movement, heat, sound. They could not detect patience. They could not register stillness. They had no protocol for an enemy that moved slower than their refresh rate. that generated less heat than their threshold sensitivity, that made less noise than their ambient filter. The Australian SAS had not defeated American technology. They had simply operated beneath its resolution. Like an organism too small for the immune system to recognize, they had moved through defenses that could not see them, because those defenses were not designed to look at that scale. This was not a new tactic. It was ancient. Hunters had used stillness and patience since before written history. Indigenous warriors had practiced invisibility as an art form. What made it revolutionary in 1984 was that modern military forces had convinced themselves that ancient principles no longer applied, that technology had made patience obsolete. The Australian SAS proved them wrong in the most embarrassing way possible, by walking into America's most secure military installation and destroying it, without anyone noticing until morning. The immediate aftermath was bureaucratic chaos. Reports were written, classified, rewritten, and classified at higher levels. The Pentagon did not want this story public. It revealed too much about defensive vulnerabilities. More importantly, it challenged assumptions that entire procurement budgets were built upon. If a 30-man team could defeat billions of dollars in security infrastructure using nothing but discipline and patience, what did that say about the technological arms race? But within the special operations community, the exercise became legend, not because it was flashy or aggressive, but because it was perfect. The Australian SAS had executed an operation that existed only in theory and had turned possibility into documentation. They had proven that invisibility was still the ultimate tactical advantage, that the willingness to endure discomfort and suppress the human need for movement could overcome any defensive system built by man. The lessons were absorbed slowly. American Special Operations Forces began integrating aspects of SAS methodology into their training. Patience became a metric. Stillness became a skill to be practiced rather than a default state. Selection courses started, including extended hide-side operations, forcing candidates to remain motionless for periods. That felt more like meditation than military training, but the deeper lesson was harder to integrate. The Australian SAS operated from a cultural foundation that American military culture found difficult to replicate. The SAS selection course, known as reinforcement cycle, does not primarily test physical capability. It tests psychological resilience, the ability to continue when continuation seems pointless, to endure when endurance offers no visible reward. Candidates are not told what they must do to pass. They are simply subjected to escalating discomfort until they quit or the course ends. This produces operators with a specific psychological profile, men who can negotiate with their own nervous systems, who can override the biological imperatives that demand movement and comfort and relief. These are not soldiers who follow orders, despite discomfort. These are soldiers who have made peace with discomfort, who have learned to exist in states of suspension that would drive most people to panic. That capability cannot be trained in 12 weeks. It cannot be purchased with equipment budgets. It is the product of culture, of institutional values that prioritize patience over aggression, invisibility over presence. The Australian SAS had cultivated that culture over decades, through operations in environments where visibility meant death, where survival required becoming part of the landscape, the symbolic object that recurred throughout. The exercise was not a weapon or piece of equipment. It was water. The Australian operators carried water in bladders integrated into their gear, sipped through tubes that required no hand movement. They rationed it with precision that bordered on religion. Each man was allocated 3 liters for 72 hours, enough to prevent dehydration, but not enough to eliminate thirst. American troops, by contrast, had unlimited access to water. Bottles were distributed freely. Coolers sat at every guard post. Hydration was treated as a right, a baseline expectation that did not require thought. This was abundance, the luxury of operating from a position of overwhelming logistical superiority. But abundance creates expectation, and expectation creates vulnerability. The American guards drank when they were thirsty, used restrooms on schedule, took breaks because breaks were available. Their routines were predictable because comfort was guaranteed. The Australians, rationing water with the discipline of men, who knew thirst intimately, had no routines. They drank when tactical situations permitted, urinated into bottles because leaving a hide site was not an option, endured thirst because endurance was the mission. Water became a metaphor for two different philosophies. American abundance created patterns that could be exploited. Australian scarcity created unpredictability that could not be countered. One side had more, the other side needed less. In a competition built on patience, needing less was the ultimate advantage. The transformation that occurred during exercise. Gallant Eagle was not in tactics or technology. It was in perception. American military planners had believed that security was a function of capability, that enough sensors and enough firepower and enough coordination could create an impenetrable defense. The Australian SAS proved that security is actually a function of awareness, that the most sophisticated system in the world is useless if it cannot recognize the threat it faces. This was not a comfortable lesson. It suggested that the billions spent on defensive technology had created an illusion of safety rather than actual protection. It implied that the solution to modern security challenges might not be better technology, but better understanding of human capability, of what patient and disciplined operators can accomplish when they are willing to endure what defensive forces are not. The Pentagon's response was predictable. Procedures were revised. Patrol patterns were randomized. Sensor coverage was expanded. Training was enhanced. These were good changes, necessary changes. But they were also reactive changes, adjustments to defend against a specific methodology, rather than a fundamental rethinking of what defense means. The Australian SAS, for their part, did not celebrate. Celebration was not their culture. They had executed a mission, documented the results, and moved on to the next challenge. There were no press conferences, no public recognition, no medals for operations that remained classified for years. This was professionalism at its highest expression. Excellence pursued not for recognition, but because excellence was the standard. But within the regiment, the operation reinforced a core belief that the fundamentals of warfare do not change, even as technology evolves. Movement, concealment, patience, discipline. These are not old-fashioned concepts made obsolete by electronics. They are timeless principles that gain power when opponents forget them in pursuit of technological shortcuts. Broader military community struggled with this lesson. Modern warfare is expensive, and expense demands justification. It is easier to justify a $10 million sensor system than a training program that teaches patience. Technology offers measurable capability, concrete specifications that can be tested and verified. Patience is harder to quantify. How do you measure the value of willingness to remain motionless? How do you budget for discipline? Yet the Australian SAS had just demonstrated that patience, properly applied, could defeat $10 million in sensors without breaking a sweat. They had shown that the most advanced military in the world could be penetrated by men carrying equipment that would not total 6 figures in value. The asymmetry was not just tactical, it was economic. It suggested that there were limits to what money could purchase in military capability, that some advantages could only be cultivated through culture and time. This realization spread slowly through special operations circles. You could not buy your way to SAS-level capability. You could not install it with a software update. You had to grow it, generation by generation, through selection standards that rejected comfort-seeking in favor of resilience, through training that prioritized mental toughness over physical prowess, through a culture that celebrated patience as the highest form of aggression, American Special Operations Forces began sending observers to Australia, attending SAS courses, studying their methodology. The relationship was collegial, but not equal. The Australians had something that could not be easily transferred: institutional memory, built through decades of operations in environments where technology failed and patience succeeded. They had refined invisibility into a science and had developed techniques for stillness that bordered on meditation. Some of those techniques were transferred. American operators learned to construct better hide sites, to control their biometric signatures, to move with the deliberate slowness that avoids detection. But the mindset was harder to transfer. American military culture celebrates aggressive action, rewards decisiveness, promotes leaders who solve problems with speed and force. The Australian SAS celebrated something different: the courage to wait, the strength to endure, the wisdom to do nothing when nothing was the right action. These are not incompatible philosophies. They are complementary, but they serve different purposes. American doctrine excels at projecting power, at achieving objectives through overwhelming capability. Australian doctrine excels at penetration, at achieving objectives through invisible precision. One tears down walls. The other walks through them. Exercise Gallant Eagle demonstrated both philosophies in stark relief. The American base represented the wall, layers of technology and manpower designed to stop penetration through sheer density of defense. The Australian operators represented the water, flowing through gaps that the wall builders did not know existed because they were focused on strength rather than integrity. The epilogue of this story is not a single moment, but a cascade of changes that rippled through military doctrine over the following decades. Exercise Gallant Eagle became a case study, a teaching tool, a cautionary tale about the limits of technological dependence. It influenced security protocols at military installations. Worldwide, it shaped selection standards for special operations units. It reminded military planners that warfare is fundamentally a human endeavor, that no amount of technology can fully replace the advantage gained by operators willing to endure what others will not. But more than procedural changes, the exercise planted a seed of doubt in the certainty that had defined American military supremacy. If 30 men could defeat the most secure base in the United States, what did that imply about vulnerability everywhere else? If patience could overcome technology in Nevada, where else was patience being applied by adversaries who watched American capability and searched for gaps? These questions did not have comfortable answers. They suggested that superiority was more fragile than believed, that dominance created blind spots, that confidence in technological advantage had obscured fundamental vulnerabilities. The Australian SAS had not just defeated a security system. They had revealed an ideology's limitations. Years later, when the exercise was partially declassified, military historians studied it with the intensity usually reserved for actual combat operations. What made it remarkable was not the tactical execution. That was flawless. It was the strategic implication that modern warfare had become so focused on capability that it had lost sight of fundamentals. The Australian SAS had not introduced new technology or innovative tactics. They had simply applied ancient principles with modern discipline. They had been patient when American doctrine demanded speed. They had been invisible when American capability depended on detection. They had endured discomfort when American forces expected relief. In every dimension, they had chosen the harder path, and the harder path had proven to be the advantage. The recurring symbol of water carried through to the end. In the Debrief, an American general asked an Australian officer how his men had maintained discipline during 72 hours in hide sites. The officer's response was simple. We chose discomfort before the operation began. Your men expected comfort because they were inside the wire. Expectation is what we exploited. That answer contained the entire philosophy. The Australians had not overcome American defenses through superior firepower or technology. They had overcome them by accepting conditions that the defenders believed no rational actor would accept. They had endured what seemed unendurable, and in doing so, had become invisible to systems designed to detect rational behavior. This is the heart of asymmetric warfare. Not fighting from weakness, but fighting from a position of different values. If your opponent measures success in comfort and technology, and you measure success in mission completion regardless of comfort, you operate from a dimension they cannot counter because they cannot imagine it. You become illegible to their defensive. Systems. The Australian SAS understood this illegibility as their core advantage. They were not trying to beat American forces and American strengths. They were introducing a different game entirely, one where patience trumped technology, where stillness defeated sensors, where the willingness to suffer created opportunities that comfort could never recognize. Exercise Gallant Eagle ended with handshakes and professional respect. The American commanders acknowledged what had occurred. The Australian operators shared their methodology with the transparency of allies who want their partners to improve. Reports were written, lessons were extracted, procedures were changed, but the real ending was quieter and more profound. Somewhere in that Nevada desert, scattered across terrain where 30 men had lain motionless for 72 hours, small depressions in the sand remained. They would last perhaps another week before wind and weather erased them completely. These shallow scrapes were the only evidence that history had occurred here, that 30 ghosts had penetrated the impenetrable and vanished without trace. The depressions would fade, but the lesson would not. Exercise Gallant Eagle proved that in an age of technological supremacy and overwhelming force, the oldest human capabilities still mattered most: patience, discipline, the willingness to endure discomfort in pursuit of objectives that required sacrifice rather than convenience. The American military learned from that lesson. Security protocols changed. Training evolved. Defensive doctrine incorporated an awareness that threats might not announce themselves, that modern warfare could still be waged at the pace of human patience rather than electronic speed. These were valuable changes, necessary adaptations to a vulnerability that had been exposed, but the deeper truth remained unchanged. The Australian SAS had not won through innovation. They had won by refusing to forget what modern warfare's obsession with technology encouraged everyone to forget: that no sensor can detect determination, that no camera can see patience, that no system can defend against operators who measure success not in comfort or speed, but in completion, regardless of cost. Not in this way. Exercise Gallant Eagle became more than a military exercise. It became a parable about what endures when everything else changes. Technology evolves, weapons advance, doctrine adapts. But the fundamentals remain constant: movement or stillness, speed or patience, comfort or endurance. These are choices that no amount of money or sophistication can eliminate. The Australian SAS chose stillness, patience, and endurance. They chose to become part of the desert floor for 72 hours. They chose thirst and discomfort and the psychological strain of motionless waiting. These choices made them invisible to every system designed to detect them. And on a cold February night in 1984, 30 invisible men walked into the most secure military base in the United States and destroyed it without firing a single shot, without triggering a single alarm, without leaving a single trace, beyond the cuts and marks that would be discovered only when the sun rose and the illusion of security evaporated like morning mist in the Nevada desert. The American guards never saw them. The sensors never detected them. The cameras never captured them. They were ghosts made real through discipline, shadows given form through patience. They proved that in a world obsessed with seeing everything, the greatest power still belongs to those who cannot be seen. This is the lesson that exercise Gallant Eagle burned into military consciousness. That abundance creates vulnerability, that technology builds dependencies, that the most sophisticated defense is useless if the threat operates beneath its resolution. 30 men with water bottles and patience proved what billions in sensors could not prevent. They proved that warfare's fundamentals have not changed, that human capability properly applied still exceeds electronic capability properly installed. They proved that the future of conflict might look less like the technological battlefield everyone prepared for, and more like ancient warfare dressed in modern camouflage. They proved that victory does not always announce itself with thunder and flame, that sometimes it arrives in silence, wearing desert tan and carrying nothing but discipline. And they proved that the oldest military truth remains the truest, that wars are not won by those who have the most, but by those who need the least and endure the longest. The American base had everything. The Australian operators had only what they could carry and the willingness to suffer for mission success. On that night in Nevada, willingness was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The desert wind that blows across Nelis Air Force Base carries no memory of what occurred therein. February 1984. The sand has long since filled the shallow depressions where 30 men became invisible. The fuel lines have been replaced, the security systems upgraded, the procedures revised. The physical evidence has vanished as completely as the operators who created it. But in classified archives and training manuals, in the institutional memory of Special Operations Forces worldwide, exercise Gallant Eagle remains, not as a defeat or a victory, but as a reminder that in an age of infinite capability, the most dangerous threat might not be the one with the most weapons, but the one with the most patience, the one willing to lie motionless while patrols pass overhead, the one who measures success in mission completion rather than personal comfort, the one who understands that invisibility is not a failure to be seen, but a decision not to be. The Australian SAS made that decision in the Nevada desert. They chose to become invisible and, in doing so, became unstoppable. They chose patience over speed, stillness over movement, discipline over comfort. These choices transformed them from soldiers into something more elemental, into manifestations of warfare's oldest principles operating against its newest delusions. And when the sun rose on February 19, 1984, and American commanders realized that their impenetrable fortress had been penetrated and destroyed by a force they never detected, the lesson was written in smoke and silence, that no wall is high enough to stop water, that no technology is sophisticated enough to detect patience, that no defense is strong enough to defeat an enemy who refuses to be seen. 30 men proved that lesson in the most humiliating way possible, by walking into the heart of American military power and walking out again without anyone knowing they had been there until the evidence of their presence could no longer be ignored. They proved that the future of warfare might belong not to those with the best technology, but to those with the best discipline, not to those who can see everything, but to those who cannot be seen. This is the truth that exercise Gallant Eagle revealed, the lesson that changed military doctrine, the story that remains classified in its details, but unmistakable in its implications, that in a world built on the assumption that everything can be detected, the ultimate power belongs to those who master the art of not being there, even when they are everywhere. The Australian SAS mastered that art in the Nevada desert. They became the wind, the sand, the empty space between sensors. They became invisible not through technology, but through will, not through equipment, but through endurance. They became what every special operations force aspires to be and few achieve, perfectly effective and completely unseen. And somewhere in that desert, carrying on wind that remembers nothing, the truth remains that 30 men with patience destroyed what 4,000 men with technology could not protect. That silence defeated censors. That stillness overcame surveillance. That the willingness to endure what others will not remains, as it has always been, the ultimate tactical advantage. This is what warfare looks like when stripped of illusion and technological pretense. Not loud, not fast, not visible, just patient, just disciplined, just invisible men doing impossible things because they understood what modern military forces had forgotten. That warfare is not about having more. It is about needing less. And in that Nevada desert, on that cold February night, 30 men who needed nothing but water and determination proved that lesson in the most devastating way imaginable. They destroyed a fortress without anyone hearing them arrive. They vanished into darkness without anyone seeing them leave. They won a war without firing a shot, without making a sound, without leaving evidence of their presence beyond the documentation. That proved they had been everywhere that mattered. And in doing so, they reminded the most powerful military in human history that power has limits, that technology has blind spots, and that the oldest form of warfare, patience exercised by disciplined operators, willing to endure what others cannot imagine enduring, remains as effective in 1984 as it was in 1944. In 1844, in the centuries before warfare had any name other than survival, the Australian SAS survived that night in Nevada by becoming invisible. They won by refusing to be seen. They taught a lesson that no amount of technology can counter and no defensive system can prevent. That the most dangerous enemy is not the one you can detect and destroy, but the one you cannot detect until the destruction is already complete. This is the final truth of Exercise Gallant Eagle. Not that Australian operators were better soldiers than American defenders, but they had preserved something that modern warfare had nearly lost. The understanding that invisibility, patience, and discipline are not outdated tactics from a primitive age. They are timeless principles that gain power every time an opponent forgets them in pursuit of technological solutions to human problems. 30 men remembered. 4,000 forgot. And in the space between memory and forgetting, between patience and expectation, between silence and technology, a fortress fell without anyone noticing until morning light revealed what darkness had accomplished. The desert keeps no record of this. The wind carries no memory. But in the soul of special operations warfare, Exercise Gallant Eagle burns eternal. A reminder, a warning, a truth that cannot be unlearned once understood, that those who cannot be seen cannot be stopped, and that the willingness to become invisible is, and will always be, worth more than any system designed to make invisibility impossible.